And welcome to Enchantment of Eternity's top 10 worst Star Trek episodes that rip off other Star Trek episodes. So, in this video, I'm going to look at episodes of Star Trek that I think take very heavily influence or are way too similar to Star Trek episodes that came out before it. It's like they're repeating the same storyline over again. Now, Star Trek has done a lot of pulling heavily, shall we say, from classic movies or even more recent movies or maybe other shows. And sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't work. But I'm not really here to talk about that. I'm here to talk about when it kind of cannibalizes itself. When it pulls too heavily from... Usually it's a previous Star Trek show that came before it. And just regurgitates the same story. To me, that sort of screams lazy writing, like, well, we're too lazy or too busy to come up with a new idea, so let's just do that other idea that's already been done. Now, one thing I want to make clear is that I'm distinguishing this from, like, tribute episodes like Trials and Tribulations, which is like a retelling of Trouble with Tribbles, because that's more directly revisiting that story, and it's not just regurgitating. The whole point of it is like to pay tribute to that episode, which is different than what I'm talking about here. And I would bring up that there are some examples of Star Trek shows pulling heavily from other Star Trek shows, but making a really great episode, like putting enough of original spin on it where it's sometimes an even better version of what came before. One example I can think of is Memento Mori, which a lot of people compared to Balance of Terror, but I actually see it more of pulling directly from the Deep Space Nine episode Starship Down, because that was about the ship in battle that was damaged and they were hiding from the enemy and running from their lives, and then there was people trapped in different sections of the ship, so you had different people, different groups of characters together and different who were trapped in different parts of the ship. So for me it was a lot, it was just like a retelling of Starship Down, but they did a better job. Like, I think it's a better episode than Starship Down. Because there's also, like, the episode of Voyager, Warhead, which is kind of just like telling the same story that the episode Dreadnought had already did in season 2 of Voyager, because it's about a super intelligent AI controlling this missile that's going to destroy this planet and the Delta Quadrant full of innocent people. However, I felt Warhead was actually an improvement over Dreadnought. I thought it was a better version of it. And then there's also Damage from Enterprise, which is my favorite episode of Enterprise. It's one of my favorite Star Trek episodes ever, which borrows very heavily from both In the Pale Moonlight and Year of Hell, but that's kind of why I love it, because it takes inspiration from these two great episodes but combines it into something different and new and makes it something different. So those are examples of stuff that takes from previous Star Trek episodes but does something great with it. Whereas what I'm about to talk about in this top 10 is lends more to the writers ran out of ideas, and so they just did the same thing over again, just not as good. And it's obvious that it's just not as good, that they're retreading the same ground, and it feels tired, and they're not putting as much effort as perhaps the first time they did it. Also, I tried to look more at episodes that are really, really similar to a specific episode, not so much as go into the tropes. Because you could go down the rabbit hole of all the episodes that are all tropey, that all follow the same pattern because the writers are lazy, but that's kind of a different topic in my opinion. For example, the trapped in a holodeck where the safeties go off, or the shuttlecraft crash, although I do touch on that because there is one episode I think is very specific to that, another specific episode, but I try not to go down the rabbit hole with all of the shuttlecraft ones, or a main character wrongfully accused and has to get a trial. All those cliches. I'm not really here to talk about those ones. I'm more of specific episodes that remind me way too much of another specific episode. So, with all that out of the way, let's go ahead and jump into my top 10 worst Star Trek episodes that rip off other Star Trek episodes. And now one more thing I will say there is I rank these according not to how bad the episode is overall, but how much it rips off the other episode. That's sort of my ranking. So there may be some episodes that I hate more than others that are not as high as on my list, because the higher on my list ones are the ones I feel like have zero originality and just completely ripped off another episode. So anyway, let's start this. So before I do my top 10, let me say a few honorable mentions that didn't quite make my list but were considered. First honorable mention is Vanishing Point from Season 2 of Enterprise. It rips off the episode Realm of Fear from Season 6 of Next Generation, which is also not a good episode, but does pretty much the same thing. It's about transporter phobia and a strange alien occurrence, and everyone thinks they're crazy, and blah, blah, blah. Next honorable mention is Favorite Son, which is a ripoff of the animated series episode Lalaurie Signal, and only gets honorable mention because most people don't care about the animated series, which is fair enough, but it's basically telling the same thing. A group of hot women attract men. In this case, in Favorite Son, it's just Terry Kim, but in Lalaurie Signal, it was all men of the Enterprise. But regardless, they attract as men to their planet, but just so they could, kill them and suck their energy out. So too similar to the other one. And my final honorable mention is All Is Possible from Discovery, which rips off the episode The Galileo 7. Now this is the shuttlecraft cliche I was alluded to just now. However, I think this too closely resembles Galileo 7, where it's a group of people who crash on the shuttlecraft and there's monsters trying to kill them. They're all arguing amongst themselves, and plus there's a little hint of final mission in there because they're all cadets or whatever. But yeah, but that's why it didn't make my top 10, because it doesn't directly rip off Galileo 7. There's no one in college mascots uniforms throwing spears from that's very obviously a stagehand target off camera. But it did have really strong vibes from Galileo 7. So now we will get into my top 10 worst Star Trek episodes that rip off other Star Trek episodes, and we'll start with my number 10, Precious Cargo, the second season Enterprise episode that rips off Elan of Troyes, the third season original series episode. Now here's the case again of an episode that's ripping off another episode that's actually wasn't good to begin with. Now Precious Cargo is, I think, one of the worst. I was in my top 5 worst of all of Star Trek. It was my number 1 worst Enterprise episode, and I fully stand by that decision. So it's nowhere near as bad as Elan of Troyes is nowhere near as bad as Precious Cargo, but that's partly because again, it's a copy of something not good. It's definitely going to be worse than the original that was never good to begin with. And there are differences, like, which is why this is only number 10 on my list. As I said, a lot of the episodes that come after this, I think, are not as bad as this episode, but not necessarily, they're just bigger rip-offs of the original that they emulate, where this one isn't that huge of a rip-off of Eliana Troyes, but it follows the same structure of a woman who's being really difficult and mean to our main everyday character, in this case Trip instead of Kirk, and they're like, rich and high up and consider themselves royalty, and they're all up themselves and have this stuck up attitude, and then eventually they get in this battle situation and they fall in love. And they move past their difficult... Oh, God, it's so terrible. It's so terrible. Anyway, then we will now move over to my number 9, which is If Wishes Were Horses, from Season 1 of Deep Space Nine. That rips off the Season 1 Next Generation episode where no one has gone before. Now, obviously, there are clear differences between these two episodes. Where no one has gone before features the Enterprise going to far-flung galaxies because of the Traveler, and they're stuck and they can't get home. It was more like the prototype for the Voyager show. If Wishes Were Horses was just a group of curious aliens who come to the wormhole and start doing weird shit to the station. But where they intersect, and where I really think If Wishes Were Horses is unoriginal and just basically doing where no one has gone before has done, is it's similar, where people's imaginations or what people are thinking of comes to life in front of them. So they materialize, your thoughts materialize in front of them, and all this weird crazy shit happens to the crew. Like in Where No One Has Gone Before, you got this guy creating a fire, you got Picard like going out of the turbo lift and like stepping into space, and then his mother just appears out of nowhere. Whereas in If Wishes Were Horses, you got it snowing on the promenade, and there's a fucking baseball player falling around, Cisco and Rumpelstiltskin falling around, and there's like emus on the promenade too. So yeah, it was just too unoriginal. It was just borrowed way too heavily from, and it's a much worse episode. If Wish Were Horses is one of my least favorite Deep Space Nine episodes. Much worse than Move Along Home. Definitively. Anyway, let me go ahead and move over to my number 8, which is Chosen Realm, from Season 3 of Enterprise, which rips off the 3rd season original series episode, Let That Be Your Last Battlefield. Now, this is more like an updated version, you could say, but I just think it does such a worse job of it. Because Let That Be Your Last Battlefield dealt more with racism and the issues, the civil rights movement of the 60s, whereas Chosen Realm dealt more was a direct analogy to Al-Qaeda and other religious extremism and the terrorism of the early 2000s. But they both were kind of told in the same way about the Enterprise encountering a group of aliens who were in an eternal, a really long, like, everlasting conflict, and they both had very strong ideals, and the Enterprise gets stuck in the middle. But the main thing that brings is similar, these episodes to much of what I call kind of a rip-off of Let That Be Your Last Battlefield, is that they both end the same way. They both end with them arriving at the aliens' planet to find that everyone's dead and their whole planet's destroyed, in this struggle, their means of not being able to like solve their differences, and having this conflict and being engulfed in this conflict has killed off their entire species. Dun dun dun. It actually worked for me and Let That Be the Last Battlefield, although I thought it was really silly how the aliens just being down the planet and just were running around forever. But with Chosen Realm, when they did that, I was just like, come on, you're just repeating Let That Be Your Last Battlefield. And plus, Chosen Realm was just, I don't know, it was too obvious of an allegory, and it was came off as too preachy, which, of course, let that be your last battlefield was definitely very preachy, but I think its message was more powerful, and it had more to say, where Chosen Realm was just like, hey, Al Qaeda's bad, which is like, no shit. And it distracted from the overall Zindi story arc of Season 3, too, so I kind of thought it was a wasted episode. Anyway, let me move over to my number 7, which is Home Soil, first season, The Next Generation episode, which rips off The Devil in the Dark, the first season, original series episode. So, yes, it's basically the same plot, where there's an alien, they go to a mining planet, and with this case, in Next Gen, it's a terraforming planet, and the original series, it's a mining planet, but same thing, where the workers on the planet are getting killed by this, alien creature, and they go to try to stop it, and stop the deaths, and to find out that, it's actually an intelligent creature who is being murdered by what the people on the planet were doing in the original series, mining, and Next Generation terraforming, but they're a strange life form that didn't seem possible. In the original series, it's a silicon-based life form, and in Next Gen, it's like some crystallized life form or whatever, which they didn't recognize as life to begin with. So it's the same plot. It's just recycled over again and not offering anything new. So, anywho, we will now get into my number 6, The Fight, the 5th season Voyager episode, which rips off Night Terrors, the 4th season, The Next Generation episode. Now, this one's hard to spot. It's not as obvious as some of the others on my list, particularly the ones towards the top of my list. It actually wasn't until I sat down to review this episode and analyze it and really looked hard at it, I was like, wait a second. This is just the exact same plot as Night Terrors. Because, to be fair, with The Fight, I was distracted by how terrible this episode is, because it is, I think, one of the worst Voyager episodes, one of the worst episodes of all Star Trek, actually. This is also my top 10 worst episodes of all Star Trek, my number 2, if I remember correctly, because to me, like, this episode's hilariously bad. I think this is the Star Trek so bad it's good, that it's just the writing is just so terrible. It's funny. But anyway, yeah, on top of that, this is just like telling the same story Night Terrors did, but just way worse. And Night Terrors I always thought of as kind of an average, okay episode of Next Gen, but compared to this episode, it seems like a masterpiece. So, the similarities are, and again, I didn't realize this until I sat down and looked at it, but the similarities is that the main ship gets stuck in this weird anomaly space thing, and they have no idea, no reason how to get out of it. And Next Gen, the whole crew start going crazy, but in Voyager, it's just Chakotay who starts going crazy, but same difference. Instead of the whole crew, it's just one crew member, but whatever. Someone starts going crazy, and then they realize the reason they're going crazy is because there's another alien in this space that's trying to communicate with them, but they're so different from our Starfleet crew that their means of communication is driving, again, in Voyager, just one person, Next Gen, the whole crew, crazy. But they have to sort of embrace this. The Next Gen is Troy, who's the one who has to communicate with the aliens, and Voyager is Chakotay through boxing. And don't even start with that. It's just so dumb. But anyway, neither here nor there. Point is, our main character of the episode has to communicate with these aliens and find a way out of this state, this weird anomaly bullshit, before this ship is destroyed and everyone dies. Same fucking plot. Same plot. And to me, that just makes what it was already a very terrible episode even worse. Anyway, let's go ahead and get into my number 5, getting into the top 5 now. We'll start with my number 5, which is the 7th season Voyager episode, Arthur, which rips off the 2nd season Next Generation episode, The Measure of a Man. Now, to be fair, only the second half of Arthur rips off Measure of the Man, but that's actually kind of worse because this episode starts off as a fairly funny, lighthearted comedy episode. And the Doctor does come off as a total arrogant, head up his ass, stuck up dickhead in this episode, but it's funny, where he, creates a hollow novel that's just obviously depicts the crew of Voyager in a very negative light, and Tom Paris does his own program where he picks the Doctor as a total asshole, and to try to show him how the crew would react to how they feel about his hollow novel, and he finally breaks through to him. So that was actually kind of enjoy that first half of the episode. It was kind of lighthearted, funny character piece, even though the Doctor, as I said, is ridiculously head up his ass and unrealistically. But the second half of the episode, all of a sudden, out of nowhere, is just doing Measure of Man all over again. Which, I mean, if you want to, it might be worth revisiting the artificial intelligence have right storyline with holograms, even though androids have earned that right, holograms haven't. So sure, I don't mind if Voyager were to revisit that and do it from a different perspective, but they didn't really do it from a different perspective. They just did Measure of Man all over again, and the fact that they kind of half-assed it and just switched it halfway in the middle of a comedy episode where it just came out of nowhere, where they were just doing the exact same plot of Measure of Man but without the Grey Picard speeches, it was just terrible. It was just terrible. Anyway, let me now get into my number 4, which is Dawn, the 2nd season Enterprise episode, which rips off The Enemy, or was it just Enemy? I think it was The Enemy, the 3rd season Next Generation episode. And now, to be fair, The Enemy itself is a ripoff of the movie Enemy Mine, which I'm sure is, probably inspired by other sci-fi works. Isn't totally original itself. But I'm not here to talk about episodes that rip off movies. As I said, I'm here to talk about episodes that rip off other episodes. And since there was already an episode that ripped off Enemy Mine, this episode was just doing it fucking again. And it offered nothing new. It was much more interesting, at least. Even though The Enemy was ripping off Enemy Mine, it brought its own original spin to it. Geordi, you really got a sense of Geordi and his feel to trying to make peace with the Romulans, and it featured the Romulans, who are a well-known, interesting race, and it helped develop them for further appearances down the line. We meet Tomalak in this episode, who is becoming a great villain in 2 more episodes, and we get the conflict of the Romulan dying on board the Enterprise, and Worf refusing to give his blood, and then Picard dealing with the consequences, and almost a war starting. Very, very powerful stuff. Whereas Dawn offers nothing new. It is just another retelling of the Enemy Mine plot of The Enemy all over again. And with Trip, with some alien I've never heard of and don't care about, and don't really buy him bonding with this alien on the planet. I don't really care about it. It's they're just doing what's already been done. It's one of the laziest examples. Anyway, you might notice there's a lot of Enterprise episodes on here, and that trend will continue. Anyway, so now let me get into my number 3, which is the Naked Now, the first season Next Generation episode that, of course, rips off the first season original series episode, The Naked Time. Now, I can imagine that some people may feel like this should have been number one, because it's the most obvious and most blatant ripoff. But in fact, the reason why it's not number one is because they at least acknowledge, like, they don't try to hide the fact, where I feel like my number two and my number one, they try to hide the fact and pretend like it's an original episode when very fucking clearly it isn't. Whereas here, at least they acknowledge, like, with the title and with everything, and with the reference to the Naked Time in this episode, yeah, they're like, and it was a mistake, and sure enough, a lot of people in retrospect saying that they shouldn't have done it, but at least, regardless of whether or not they should have done it, at least they acknowledge it. At least they are upfront about it and tell you with the title, hey, we're just gonna retell the Naked Time again, but we're just gonna do it for next gen, and they were trying to, key into that original series nostalgia in order to get people to like this new show, which a lot of people were really iffy about, especially since the first season wasn't really that good. But this was the very second episode after that lackluster pilot. So yeah, they were trying to just for like Deep Space Nine brought in Q in their first season and never brought him in again. They were trying to tap into that established fan base, which is fair enough. But this episode is just doing what the Naked Time already did better and doing it worse. And when the Naked Time was a funny and actually suspenseful and interesting character story that got you into the different characters and how they would react when their logic and ambitions are stripped down, was very interesting and a very powerful episode, where here they just all get horny and then fucking Data gets it, which doesn't make any sense, and Riker doesn't get it, even though he passes it on to three other people who pass it on to other people, yet he's still perfectly fine by the end of the episode. What makes him super fucking immune and Data is off getting laid by Yar. I don't know. It was, and the plot with Wesley taking over the engineering, of course, is just a rip-off of Riley taking over the engineering, but done worse. And yeah, it was a bad decision overall. But as I said, so it does make it all the way up to number 3, but not number 1, because at least they acknowledge it. These next 2 episodes do not acknowledge it and whoa, we're original. No, you're not. So we'll start with my number 2, which is E Squared, 3rd season Enterprise episode, which is a ripoff of the 5th season Deep Space Nine episode Children of Time. So I love season 3 of Enterprise, and I particularly love the ending of season 3 of Enterprise, where they get into the whole Xindi arc. I think is amazing. Some of my favorite, the 3-parter, the last 3 episodes of the season, I thought was fucking prime television. I saw a bad review for the finale of season 3 recently, and people they're entitled to their wrong opinions if they want it, but because it's amazing, it's fucking amazing. But the one blemish on the end of season 3 is this episode, which was filler, and it's obviously filler just there to fill up their episode quota, because it kind of interferes with the momentum they had with the Xindi arc, because we have to travel through this nebula where there's pirates, and we're gonna meet this other Starfleet ship, and it was just a complete waste. And apparently, originally, the idea of this episode was different, where they would actually meet a different ship that actually traveled through time. But the producers and the suits or whatever was no, we can't introduce a new ship. It has to be, Enterprise. But in fact, by making that decision, they're just dooming this episode to be an exact carbon copy of Children of Time, because this idea was already fucking done. And even though I'm not a huge fan of Children of Time, because there's there's time travel issues, and the ending irked me. It was like trying to be all edgy and emotional where it didn't actually fit the story. But at least it was definitely told the story better than this episode did, for sure. Where they're meeting, where the crew meets their descendants of apparently they had traveled back 200 years and to the past, and then had all these children who had children, and now this present day crew is meeting their descendants, and that's a very interesting concept, which Deep Space Nine already fucking did. So it's no longer an interesting concept. Now they're just doing the same thing that's already been done, but not as good. Anyway, let me now get into my number one worst Star Trek episode that rips off another Star Trek episode, and that is Oasis, the first season Enterprise episode that, of course, rips off the second season Deep Space Nine episode, Shadow Play. I don't know why Enterprise is so interested in ripping off Deep Space Nine, but anyway, maybe they thought that no one really watched Deep Space Nine, so they could just be lazy and just do that plot over again. But anyway, Shadow Play was by no means a masterpiece, but again, it kind of looks like one compared to this episode. So, in Shadow Play, Odo and Dax travel this planet, the Delta Quadrant, where people are mysteriously, the inhabitants that live there are mysteriously vanishing. They make friends with a young girl, and they find out at the end that the whole trick was just that they were all holograms, and it was just the holographic emitter was failing, and that's why people were disappearing. So Dax just repairs the hologram thing, and so that and doesn't tell anyone they're holograms, so they just think everything's hunky-dory. And Oasis is the Enterprise episode where they are told by a trader that there's a ship where they can go to get parts and repairs, but it's haunted. And they go there and they meet a bunch of people that seemingly appear out of nowhere, so they think are ghosts or whatever. But at first they think it's just a crew, but then they realize they find the dead body of the crew and realize that these are holograms of the crew that they had created. There's one girl who is real, just like in Shadow Play there was one old dude who was real, who recreated the whole thing. And yeah, so it's, you could say like the entire episode, there are enough differences where the entire episode isn't a rip-off of the entire episode the way E Squared was, but this one pisses me off more because the twist ending was something we've already fucking seen, and it's just worse in so many ways. Instead of having like the great camaraderie that Odo had with this young girl and that relationship they were building, which was really interesting, we have Trip hitting on a hot chick. Funnily enough, Rene Aubergenois is also in this episode. He was also in Shadow Play, and we have him wasted in this terrible episode. And the whole part of them, ooh, it's a ghost, was so childish, the way they played it. Like, ooh, there's the ghost there, and the way Hoshi and Mayweather on the bridge, oh, you're scared of the ghost? I'm like, what am I, 4? Like, what the fuck is going on here? And then it wasn't the least bit scary when these people appeared. And then they revealed, oh, they're just holograms. I was like, haven't I seen this before? Yeah, I fucking have in the episode Shadow Play. Like, whoa, is it supposed to be shocking that it's shocking to me how lazy these writers are, that they just rip off ideas from other ones instead of coming up with their own shit and try to do this silly, crazy, this creepy ghost story when it just comes off as childish and dumb. So yes, I really don't like that episode. That combined with the fact that it just did the exact same thing Shadow Play did makes this my number one worst Star Trek episode that rips off another Star Trek episode. So that is it for my top 10 on Star Trek episodes that rip off other Star Trek episodes. If you enjoy this, please check out my channel, as I do many more top 10s and many more Star Trek videos in general, as well as cover many other shows on my channel, like Lord of the Rings of Power, House of the Dragon, Star Trek Lower Decks, and more. So be sure to subscribe so you can keep up with all of that, and thanks a lot for watching.